Everyone, can I welcome you to the first meeting in 2015 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Everyone present is reminded to switch off mobile phones as they do affect the broadcasting system. But as meeting papers are provided in digital format, you may see members using tablets during this meeting. Can I also welcome Joan McAlpine, who is joining us this morning. And agenda item number 1 is declaration of interests. I'd like to welcome David Stewart as a new member of the committee and invite him to declare any relevant interests.
Thank you, Convener. I have no relevant interest to declare.
Thank you. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the outgoing member of the committee, Mark Griffin, for his very worthwhile contribution to our work and to wish him well on his new committee. Agenda item 2 is a decision on taking business in private. Can I seek the agreement of the committee to take item number 4 in private? Thank you. Agenda item number 3 is the Scottish Housing Regulator Annual Report 2013-14. The purpose of this section of the agenda is to hear evidence from representatives of the Scottish Housing Regulator, focusing on its performance and annual report and accounts for 2013-14, as well as its approach to regulation. Unfortunately, the chair of the Scottish Housing Regulator is unable to join us today as she is unwell, but on behalf of the committee I would like to wish her a speedy recovery. However, we are able to welcome Anne Jarvie, board member, Lisa Peebles, board member, and Michael Cameron, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Housing Regulator. Can I invite you, Ms Jarvie, to make an opening statement?
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm making this statement on behalf of the Chair, Kay Blair, and I will convey your best wishes to her when I see her later today. Can I just start by expressing my thanks to the previous convener of the committee, Maureen Watt, for hosting the regulation's important stakeholder event that was held in this building in May of last year. And I think most of us that attended it and the feedback that we've had has been very positive about that. So thank you very much indeed for that. Through this introductory statement, I'd like to touch on some of the highlights of the past year or so, the value we add, our engagement with stakeholders, and the success of our work on the Charter. Since we last appeared at this committee, we've had a busy, challenging, and we think successful year. The highlights have been our planned risk-based and proportionate engagement with 61 RSLs and 15 councils, all with the single objective of protecting the interest of tenants and other service users. The launch of the Charter landlord reports and easy-use comparison tools has been well received. The new IT system allowing landlords to submit information quickly and easily to us online has been taken forward. The publication of our thematic inquiry report on housing options, our continued support to RSL board members, including through our Governance Matter events, and the first use of our statutory intervention powers in 2 landlords, again to protect the interests of tenants. It is through this type of work and our effective regulation that we add value to social housing. Giving confidence to lenders and investors in social housing is hugely important. Over $4 billion is invested in social housing by private lenders and investors. And recently, one of the major lenders to the sector told us that our effective regulation has a value of around 115 basic points, or 1.15% on lending to landlords. At current levels of RSL debt, that equates to a saving of around 40 million every year on the interest charges RSLs pay. That's a tenfold return on the cost of regulation and is a significant benefit to RSLs. We also add value in other no less important, although perhaps less quantifiable, ways. We empower tenants by giving them timely, accessible, and comparable information on landlords' performance. We help to protect the hard-earned good reputation of those social landlords who provide good service and are well managed. We provide guidance and learning opportunities through our engagement case studies. We help landlords to improve by providing benchmarking information. We will build on the success of last year, including through the initiation of a programme of service-focused thematic inquiries. This includes one on gypsy travellers, something I know this committee has an interest in. This uses our analysis of the data which we collected for the first time through the 2013-14 annual return on the Charter from the 20 social landlords who manage gypsy traveller sites. Our inquiry will look at the reasons behind significant variances in pitch rents and customer satisfaction levels, and will highlight good practice we find and make recommendations on improvement. We expect to publish early this year. We place great importance on communication and engagement with our broad range of stakeholders. We are aware that effective regulation will mean that we are not always popular with all of them, but we value effective, respectful, and professional relationships with our stakeholders. This year, we published independent research into how we communicate, involving 270 of our stakeholder organisations. This found strengths in our approach and areas we can further enhance. It is important that we work with our principal stakeholders, tenants and service users, to ensure we understand their priorities. Last year, we published the second report on the views of our national panel of over 300 tenants and service users, and we conducted our separate research into the service priorities of registered tenant organisations in Scotland. We have established formal liaison arrangements with the regional network of RTOs, and we now meet regularly with them. And lay tenant assessors contributed significantly to our work last year. These engagements help shape what we do, and we work with tenants to co-produce the landlord reports we published in August. We know that this committee will have heard a range of views about the regulator, including both praise and criticism. It is very difficult for us to respond to general criticisms, and I am sure you will agree that effective regulators are seldom popular with those they regulate. Indeed, an overly popular regulator may not be the one that's most fulfilling its responsibility and its role. Having said that, we are always very keen to hear feedback, either positive or negative. We have very positive relationships with many of our stakeholders, including with lenders, auditors to the sector, and with many regulated bodies. That is not to say we cannot improve, and we are always keen to listen to help shape even more effective regulation. We want effective dialogue to help us understand stakeholders' views and for stakeholders to understand how we work. To that end, we are working constructively with SFHA and Glasgow and West of Scotland Forum on an information note about how we apply in practice the policies in our regulatory framework on inquiries and interventions. In addition, we are keen to work with landlord representatives to drive good practice and encourage them to develop mechanisms to enable landlords to better support each other, especially where a landlord is experiencing difficulties. Leadership from within the sector is very important and something we would like to see develop even further. Finally, I would like to say a little more on the very important and empowering landlord reports and online comparison tools we made available in August. I hope you've had the chance to look at these and the demonstration video we provided to the committee. We have received excellent feedback from stakeholders, particularly tenants, on how it helps users compare and contrast landlords' performance. We will publish soon an insightful national report on our analysis of the Charter, and we'll make sure you receive copies of it. We'd be happy to take questions on any of this or any other matter that you may wish to raise with us. Thank you.
Thank you for setting Sorry. Thank you for setting the scene with that opening statement, Ms Jarvie. Can you kick off our proceedings this morning by highlighting from the annual report and accounts what you think have been the main outcomes of the Scottish Housing Regulator's work and what you think the key achievements of the regulator have been over 2013-14?
Yes, I think that the major thing this year has been the work on the Charter, and in particular the platform that has been developed to enable the information to be returned to us with as much ease as possible. And I think the success of that was displayed by the number of RSLs who did in fact respond within the time frame that they were required to do so, and also feedback to us. Not only did they find the platform very helpful, but they also found our helpline that was there to help them, to guide them through the process, particularly significant. I think in addition to that, we have worked hard with our stakeholders, and in particular built increasingly robust arrangements to ensure that we involve tenants in as much as we possibly can all that we do, and that's very much appreciated. I think it's opening up the avenue for us to link with people that we were not meeting or seeing or hearing from in the past, and that can only be positive to the work we do, because after all, the reason that we're established is to make sure that tenants get a good deal in respect of their relationship with their landlords. And I think these are probably the two most significant things. But Michael, do you want to add anything to that?
Perhaps the only thing I would add into that would be the publication earlier last year of our thematic inquiry report on housing options, which was a major publication for us, the first such report. It was well received, even though it was a challenging report for both local authorities and for Scottish Government in terms of some of the recommendations that we set out there. That set a pattern for work which we'll develop through the course of this year, and as Anne indicated, one of the first ones that we'll be bringing forward will be a thematic inquiry on gypsy travellers and the quality of site provision from social landlords that provide those sites to gypsy travellers.
Just ask you then what you think the biggest challenge facing the regulator will be in the coming year.
I think it's quite a bit of it's going to be more of the same, and I think as the Charter beds down, then it's going to be really important that we keep the momentum of that going, and that we encourage tenants to use the information that's made available to them so that they understand where their own landlord sits against the other landlords in the country, but equally I think will assist them with some of the questions that they perhaps could and should be asking that may not have been doing so up until now. But I think increasingly it is about building relationships. I mean, we've got a job to do, and we will do that, and we will regulate, and we will do it with the appropriate touch that's required in the given circumstances. But I think the important thing is that we continually communicate with people so that they understand what it is that we are there to do, how we are going to be doing it, and what contribution they can make to help us to do it as well as we possibly can. Key also in that respect, I think, is the whole issue about just making sure that we can deal with regulation in the most appropriate way. So we do talk quite a lot about proportionality, and I think that's increasingly important, and that we make sure that we only involved to a very high level with those landlords who need that amount of intervention and support and help, and that where possible, although we have had to use statutory means over this last few months, but where we can do that, we will continue to do it without the need to resort to statute, because it is much better to be alongside rather than being top down, and from our experience, it works much better being alongside than being top down. So I think it's the increasing and the building of the relationships and the understanding of what we're here to do, why we're here to do it, and what can be expected of us.
Okay, thank you very much. My colleague Alec Johnson has some questions on the interaction with registered social landlords. pass it on to him.
Thank you very much, Convener. Both in the opening statement and in the last answer, you raised the issue of proportionality. Now, we have taken the opportunity to speak to a number of people who have had cause to work with the regulator, including representatives of RSLs, and we've been given the impression that some of them believe that you could be more proportionate in the way you approach regulation. How would you react to that suggestion?
I think I'd be very surprised if some of them didn't think that. I mean, it's always going to be the case that people feel that, and particularly, it's really interesting because I've done quite a bit of ferreting around as I've been out and about just to hear where people are really coming from. And it is interesting that those who have required assistance think we're probably just about spot on with proportionality when they reflect back on it. And I think that's the important thing. It's always much more difficult to be as objective when you're going through a process as it is when you think, oh my goodness, thank goodness we've got to the end of this process and we're now in a far better place than we were. So I would be surprised if some people were not saying it. I hope that the people that have been alongside us when we've been trying to assist them in order to overcome the problems that they have would be a little bit more understanding of what our proportionate approach is. But it is important that we continue to focus on that and that we only engage where absolutely necessary and that we don't add a resource and a problem to ourselves as well as to them that we don't need to and that therefore we are proportionate. So, would you like Michael to say something a bit more about that, or are you content?
It's entirely up to you to answer the question.
I mean, I think what it is worth saying is that our regulation engagements follow a well-established and transparent risk assessment process. That's the cornerstone of how we comply with our statutory duty to be a proportionate regulator. We then publish a regulation plan for every RSL or local authority called an Assurance and Improvement Plan for local authorities, following that risk assessment where we will have an engagement. So we're very transparent about how we have arrived at the need for engagement and the form of engagement that will be. And it is absolutely the case that we would always look to be as proportionate as we possibly can, or we will look to do what we need to do with as little intervention as is possible. That's always what drives us. Critically, this is, of course, about ensuring that we do what is necessary to protect the interests of tenants and other service users. That's our sole objective when we engage with landlords.
On the subject of transparency, some RSLs have suggested that they would benefit from greater transparency around your decision-making process and also the way in which you engage with RSLs sometimes on an informal basis.
Yep. I mean, we believe that the majority of our RSLs have well-developed kind of understanding of our role, so we start with that premise. Sometimes we discover that people are less knowledgeable, but on the whole, we think they are very well established in that respect. And we've been working constructively with Scottish Federation of Housing Associations and the Glasgow and West of Scotland Housing Forum to produce an information note about how we apply, and I think this is the important thing, how we apply and practice the policies that are set out in our regulatory framework about inquiries and investigations. So we're working on that currently, and that will be being discussed further in the next few months, and then we'll be going out for consultation, and we hope that that will help to open up the debate and I suppose encourage people to ask us questions if there are parts of it that they don't understand. But we have listened carefully to the allegations that we are not transparent. We think we are transparent. There are times when it is difficult to be as transparent because there are times when we may be working in a way that we have to maintain a bit of confidentiality until we get further through the programme. But we hope that this information note that is being developed with others will help to take us one stage further in convincing people about our transparency.
Do you believe you have the balance right between formal and informal engagement?
Yeah.
In on that, I think we regulate in accordance with the powers and duties that are placed upon us by the Housing Scotland Act. So everything we do is based in those statutory duties and powers, and we set out how we apply those powers and duties in our regulatory framework. The vast majority of our regulatory engagement, as I've said, follows a well-understood risk assessment process and is communicated through the publication of the regulation plans. And we believe it's very important that we are transparent in how we regulate and that all stakeholders, tenants, service users, landlords and others understand how we work and, importantly, what they can expect. I think it's also important that within the statutory framework that this Parliament has set for us, that we are able to use our judgment, make decisions and operate in the most effective way to ensure that we can protect those interests of tenants and service users. And sometimes, as Anne has already suggested, sometimes that means we'll have to conduct engagements in confidence, at least until the regulatory concern has been addressed or we have had an appropriate level of assurance. That's also about protecting the reputation of social landlords. It's appropriate for us to have a full understanding of the situation before we would necessarily go public on what our engagement has been. But I think, as Anne has said, despite all that, the majority of landlords that we engage with have a clear and full understanding of how we go about our business.
Some
wanted to come in on that specific point, if that's okay.
Well, it was actually a question before that, but I can come in at the end if you want.
Okay, I'll let you continue, then we'll come in at the end. Fine.
Okay. Some RSLs have suggested there's room for a more consistent and a more collaborative approach. How would you react to that?
We think our approach is consistent. That's not to say that we do the same type of engagement with every landlord. The type of engagement we have is very much dependent on the risks that are evident to us following our risk assessment and is proportionate to the scale of the risks and the issues that we find. So it's not the case that we apply a one-size-fits-all approach to regulation. It's very much determined by those risks, the nature of the organisation and the nature of the issue that we are addressing. Sorry, could you repeat the second part of that?
A collaborative approach.
A collaborative approach. I mean, I think it is important that we work with those that we regulate to ensure that there is mutual understanding of roles and responsibilities, that there's a good understanding of what our regulation is there for, how it operates, what it's seeking to achieve. I think it is also relevant that we have, first and foremost, regard to our statutory objective, which is to protect the interests of tenants and other service users. That's what determines the nature of engagement that we will have with landlords. Again, having said that, we have very good working relationships with the majority of our stakeholders, and we also have been working very constructively over the last period with the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations and the Glasgow West of Scotland Forum to look at ways where we can improve on transparency, where we can help people to better understand what our role and responsibilities are.
We heard from some RSLs that they believe there may be a certain lack of trust in the relationship between the regulator and themselves, and that this may in some cases cause them to be less keen, reluctant perhaps, to seek advice from the regulator. Do you believe that that situation exists, and have you any course of action which is designed to improve the level of trust where it may be below what we would expect?
I think part of the difficulty is we don't actually, people make statements, but they don't always back it up with evidence, and that makes it very difficult for us to analyse that and understand where they're coming from and what it is that we could do that would make it different. I mean, trust is a really interesting thing because it's two ways, isn't it? And I mean, we can be sitting having a discussion, a conversation with a group or with an individual and think that things are moving in the right direction and they're going well, and then hear at a later stage that that's not the case. I think both parties need to work hard at the trust relationship if we're ever going to move this forward. And we've certainly, particularly over this last year, year and a half, put a lot of effort into trying to engage with more and more people so that we can demonstrate that we are open, that we are listening, we're a listening organisation, and we want to move forward in a learning mode. But we have a job to do, and we have a job to regulate that sector. And that is always going to, I think, put a tension, potentially, into a relationship. So I think even when we can put half a tick in a box, we will still have to go back and think, when can we get to the complete tick? Because I don't think this will be repaired, if repair is the word that's necessary, in a day. It will be, if you just stop thinking about it, then you may just slip back again if that's the stage. But we are absolutely hoping, and the board have discussed this frequently, and are determined that we're going to try and dispel this view, whether it's right, wrong or indifferent, but work hard at trying to dispel it. So we're on the case, I think, is probably the best way to describe our current position.
Thank you very much.
Mary?
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to come back to proportionality and the perception of proportionality in your dealings with RSLs. And I suppose it relates directly to a comment that you made about, in hindsight, people tend to say that the degree of regulation was proportionate. So do you have an ongoing process of review after you have been through a process with an RSL? Do you have a method of reviewing how successful or not successful, or if there was something different that you could have done? And if you do have that, how do you build it into your ongoing regulation?
I mean, I'll just make an opening statement on that, and then, because Michael's much nearer the detail of it, I mean, I did mention in the response to the last question about trying to be a learning organisation, and as a board we do ask for feedback. So we do ask for an analysis of cases as they've been taken forward. And indeed, at our last meeting, we actually had one of the regulator managers attend the meeting and give us a case study of her involvement in regulating that particular RSL. And that really brought it all to life. It made it vivid for me anyway. I much prefer to hear and see pictures rather than to read, and that really made it absolutely vivid. And can I say that the degree of tension in any relationship when things are not 100% right and somebody's trying to help you to make it a bit better is on both sides. I mean, I came away and I reflected on what that manager had been through with that organisation, and it must have been quite traumatic at times, and it would have meant a huge discipline to be able to hold back from maybe wanting to say things that they ought not to be saying, for example, because it is a tense situation at the beginning. I think once relationships are formed, once it's crystal clear that things are beginning to move in the right direction, then people can relax a little bit. But I'll let Michael go on a bit more because he knows the detail.
Yes, it's worth saying that following every major engagement that we have, every major regulatory engagement that we have a formal lessons learning exercise that then is built back into how we approach subsequent engagements that may be of a similar nature. That's a standard practice that we employ throughout our organisation. The annual risk assessment process that we go through is a constantly evolving and developing process, both to reflect the changing risks that there are in landlords' operating environment, but also to build on developments that there may be in regulatory approaches. And we also publish through the Governance Matters series of reports, case studies of significant engagements that we've had with landlords, principally as a way for other landlords to have access to information that may enable them to consider their own situation, whether there are lessons to be learned for them out of that. And actually, I'm aware that there's been some comment on the tone of Governance Matters publications, but I directly have had very positive feedback from a large number of landlords who say that they do make use of Governance Matters as very much a review tool for how they're operating themselves.
So when you go through the feedback process and there is a review, and if you recognise that there are perhaps things that you could or should have done differently, is that then communicated back to the organisation or person that you were involved in? Are they aware that you have taken on board what's been said and you are going to make changes? Because it's very important that they realise that any comments that they make or any feedback that they give is taken on board, and if you believe you should make changes, that you do it.
There's probably not a formal process where we have that kind of feedback, because I think where you're having that type of regulatory engagement, it's not necessarily the right vehicle to have that kind of dialogue. And the kind of lessons that we would look to learn are very much around whether in those particular circumstances the right tools were used, the right approach was used, whether there were ways we could have done it to achieve the same outcome in perhaps a less intensive way, or so there are not necessarily those obvious straightforward feedback processes to the organisation involved. It's an interesting point you raise, and we'll give some thought to whether there actually are ways that we can make more widely known the types of changes that we might bring into how we operate as a consequence of some of that. We do a wee bit of that through the Governance Matters publications, but we'll give some further thought to that.
It's from the very kind of basic level of building trust. Yeah. If the people you're involved in can physically see that you have made changes, that would help to build trust and remove some of the uncertainty and concerns that they have.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. James?
Thank you. Just to go back to the proportionality aspect of it, a number of the RSLs talked about you sometimes focusing on micromanagement rather than considering the big picture. Can I ask a couple of things first? Do you understand why they would think that? Do you recognise that it may be an issue? And if so, how could you either change it if it is an issue, or change their perception if you consider it's not an issue?
I think Michael, because he's near that process between
It's certainly not the case that we are here to micromanage, and I would be extremely concerned if I thought that we were using the limited resources we have to do that. It's not for us to run RSL's businesses. That's for the RSLs. In particular, it's for the governing bodies of the RSLs to ensure that they are operating in a way that means they are financially healthy and that they are delivering for tenants and other service users. We will always look to engage in the most proportionate way that we possibly can, in a way that ensures that the organisation itself is given the opportunity to address any issues that we find. We have very limited resources. We focus those on the key issues, the major risks. That's done through, as I said, a very well understood annual risk assessment process. So I have to say I wouldn't recognise the reality being that we are involved in micromanagement.
Came from more than one RSL, which is why it's clearly an issue of perception, if not reality. So is there some way that the regulator can try and ease the concerns of some of the RSLs? Because clearly this would be based on, I suspect, personal experience.
Tackling perceptions is always a difficult issue, and it's very difficult to comment when there's not specifics. I don't know the nature of the concern that's been expressed, therefore it's quite challenging to discuss that. As Anne has already touched on, where organisations have been through a regulatory engagement with us and resolved the situation and moved on, you'll often get a very different set of messages back from them. And whether some of the concerns are based on direct experience or whether it's part of the noise that you hear within the sector, without specifics, it's very difficult to comment more on that.
Okay, fair point. Thank you.
I take your point about on the question of popularity of a regulator. If you were very popular, maybe perhaps question what you're doing. On the other hand, we have received a level of concern about the regulator's activities, approach, tone, attitude, those kind of things. Could I ask a question about the composition of the board and indeed your officers, if you like, in terms of their experience of the sector and how many have actually been actively engaged in RSLs, so that the sector would recognise that these are people with us who've had a long-running stake and engagement in the sector, and therefore they feel they can trust without any second thoughts about it.
I mean, it's a very interesting comment that you make, and I think we would all probably have different views. We'll give you the composition, but I mean, there is an issue about being too close to a sector if you are a regulator, and therefore you don't see the wood for the trees, and you may not then be as open-minded in your judgment as you would be otherwise. So I'm fair to say that the board is comprising of both sides of the coin, if you like. Lisa will say something here because she is a tenant herself.
As well as being a board member, I'm a long-term tenant of social housing. In fact, I've only ever lived in social housing my whole entire life. So I feel that as a recipient of services from several social landlords, I've probably got as much experience as anybody. Also, having been a community activist, I understand the wider role the social landlords often provide as well. And I think we have got a pretty good balance of skills within our board. It's not always necessary that people have been the recipients of services, but in fact, if there's comparable organisations or sectors that people have worked within, that they can bring those skills to our organisation, then that can often be just as good as having worked, directly or received the services.
We also had another tenant board member who, unfortunately for her personal circumstances, left us in December, and obviously we will consider when Kay is in a position so to do what should happen as far as that's concerned. Your officers?
I think it's also worth saying that the Parliament set the regulator up as an independent body, independent of Scottish Government, but also independent of the sector that it regulates. I think recognising the importance of the board being able to bring an objective perspective to that regulation. That said, there is some experience of social housing on the board, but there's also experience of other relevant disciplines that enable us at a board level to have a broad perspective on those organisations that we regulate. Our staff are drawn from a number of disciplines, many of them from social housing itself. Many of our staff members have worked in social landlords or worked in social housing in various different ways. A number of them have also come from other regulated fields and bring skills sets that are critically important to the job we do that aren't necessarily directly from social housing itself. So financial analysis skills, for example, and others who have worked in other regulatory bodies. So we want to ensure that we have a broad range of skills that enable us to do the job that Parliament has set us to do.
And we have a lawyer, but he works very closely with social housing and social housing issues, so he brings a different take on the housing position, if you like, and how we can best regulate it. I mean, my own background is health and civil servant. And in that context, I've played TIG, if you like, around the housing sector all my life, although I've not directly worked in it before. So quite a number of us have had that kind of exposure.
Okay. Notwithstanding what you say about the independence of regulators, I do think this is an issue that does need to be, the whole question of trust, etc., needs to be addressed, because quite a number of the people that we've been in contact with don't wish to they wish to remain anonymous, and I don't think that's a particularly healthy situation for us to be facing. And perhaps moves in this direction that I'm suggesting ought to be considered to try and address that situation.
Yeah, I mean, I did touch on the fact that we very seldom are given evidence to back up either the things we're told about perception or whatever, and that makes it really difficult for us. And if things are done anonymously, which is another way that information can come to us, you can't actually speak face to face to the individual or the individuals and get clear indication from them exactly where they're coming from and what the things are that are concerning them. But we will, I mean, I can absolutely guarantee that the board are committed to working alongside all our stakeholders, whoever they may be, and to trying to get them to understand us better and us to understand them better, and to try and build that mutual trust I was talking about, because it is two-way.
Thank you. Mr Cameron, you spoke earlier and said that it wasn't for the regulator to run and micromanage the business of the RSLs, but clearly there's a desirability for landlords to achieve the outcomes and standards set out in the in the Social Housing Charter, and a very specific role that you have to monitor and report on landlords' performance in achieving those standards and outcomes. So can you tell us how that process is working? Because I'm conscious that we're into the first year of the annual returns on the Charter, and I would be grateful if you could update the committee on how that process is progressing, and also highlight any feedback. Ms Jarvie, you mentioned the importance of feedback earlier. Any feedback that you've had from landlords, tenants or service users about the usefulness of the annual Charter returns?
I'm going to ask Michael just to kick off, and then I'm going to bring Lisa in, because Lisa has been very close to having a look at the information and has got some examples of how things are being handled out in the real world, if you like, with the RSLs.
Well, this was an important year for the Scottish Social Housing Charter, in that it's the year in which landlords provided us with the first set of information and data returns, and then we analysed that information and pushed that back out so that tenants, other service users, landlords themselves, and anyone with an interest in social housing was able to look at landlord performance and compare that performance. So it's been a significant year in that regard. The tools which we've put out there, the information that we've published, has been almost universally well received, I think in particular by tenants. We also undertook a survey of social landlords earlier last year to assess how they found the new tools that we've put in place to enable them to provide us with information back. And again, we got a very high satisfaction level back from those landlords. But I'll perhaps ask Lisa to come in.
Well, as Michael has said, last year was really important. We launched the Landlord Portal, which was an online facility which allowed landlords to deliver their data directly to us online, and as well as being a process that allows us to extract information really easily. It was also important that it was an easy system for landlords to negotiate their way around, and certainly all the feedback that we've had in the surveys that we've done, I think around 90%, 92% of the respondents have said that it was a very positive experience being able to use that. And the other significant thing around the Charter that we've done is to produce the landlord reports. And the landlord reports were seen as a way of providing tenants with a snapshot of how well their landlord is actually performing. And alongside that, there's the comparison tool, which I hope you have had a wee chance to look at. And that comparison tool allows you to benchmark your organisation against any other organisations in the country. And what's really interesting about that is it's not just there as an opportunity for tenants to say, well, why is my rent so high and somebody else's is so cheaper, or why do my repairs take longer? It actually provides a wee bit of clarity, because people can often see that the services that they're receiving are really good in comparison to other landlords. So that whole process of developing those charter tools was very, very important. We have had
see that their own individual experience had not been as good or had been better than the returns that are available in the reports.
Well, I suppose all the data was probably going to produce averages. So as a tenant, you might find that it took 2 weeks to get a repair. That on average, it's done much quicker, and that's something then that they can take up with their landlord and say, well, what was the actual process? Did something go wrong there? What was peculiar to my situation? So again, it empowers tenants to target their questions in the most appropriate way. But overall, we've had really positive feedback for tenants. And certainly, although our systems are online, we require landlords to provide those landlord reports to their tenants, it's usually done through newsletters, and certainly only yesterday I was looking at a Glasgow-based association's winter newsletter, and not only did they publish their own information, but they had published the comparative information for all the surrounding landlords. So that was incredibly useful, and takes into consideration the fact that not everybody's online. People don't always have broadband. People don't always have the facilities or the technology to be able to access that. So it's a kind of belt and braces approach that we've got. We've got the online services, but we've also got that backed up by the requirement for the landlord to actually provide it as well. And over the next few years, what the Charter's going to, what we're going to do is have more of an emphasis on things like service quality, value for money, rent affordability. All of that becomes an awful lot easier as an organisation for us to do with these tools that we've spent an awful lot of time, investing in. And as we've already mentioned, the information, the data that we get from it informs how we go forward. And again, it has informed the nature of the thematic inquiries that we'll do. And the first of that is going to be the information that we've got on Gypsy Travellers, because certainly there's been some huge variation within the data that we've got back about what services people are getting within sites, and the rents that are being charged. So we've now got an opportunity to dig down into that and find out exactly what's going on. So,
just ask you mentioned the need to raise awareness amongst tenants, and you mentioned an example of that in the form of newsletters, and you also highlighted the digital exclusion that applies to some tenants who don't have access to the internet. So how should we be addressing both of those points?
Well, the issue around raising, if it's raising our profile as an organisation, then with tenants, we've done that in quite a lot of ways. The previous incarnation of the regulator was incredibly innovative in using tenant assessors, and we've continued to use tenant assessors, although the system that they're working within is slightly different. We have established a national panel of tenants and service users, which is sitting somewhere around the 300s, quite a significant amount of people. So we use that as in order to kind of sense check our regulatory objectives and see how what we're doing actually impacts the tenants. We continue to engage through the RTOs and the defined networks that are there, and something simple like our branding being on those newsletters against the landlord report actually informs tenants that we exist, because quite often tenants will passively receive services, and you know, if things are okay, then why would they know that there's a regulator? But now that we're able to get a wee bit more access to tenants, it's a good opportunity to raise our profile and let them know that we're actually there in order to protect their rights. Sorry, I've forgotten the second part of your question.
There was digital exclusion.
Well, digital exclusion is a huge issue for every organisation, and that's why it's really important to not provide this information just through one mechanism and to have that backed up through other ways. We would also, we know that landlords often go above and beyond when it comes to how they support their tenants to access information, and I would expect that most good landlords, if a tenant came in and said, you know, I want more information than you've provided me, but I don't have access to the internet, I suspect that most landlords would facilitate that. You know, it's not necessarily a requirement, but, you know, landlords understand the needs of their tenants.
Can I ask you, Mr Cameron, how you're using the information in the Charter Returns to develop your approach both to empowering tenants, as Ms Peebles mentioned, and also your approach to risk assessment? For example, will it lead to more targeted intervention?
Yeah, there's a number of ways in which we're using the information from the annual returns in the Charter. We've already touched on it being an important way for us to understand where the key issues may rest in social housing and target our programme of thematic studies to look at those issues. So it drives that programme. We are very much about getting that information as widely available in as many usable forms as we possibly can, very much to encourage tenants themselves to start to hold their landlords to account for their performance. Importantly, we will also use the information that we now have in our annual risk assessment processes for both local authorities and RSLs, so that, as Lisa's already touched on, service quality, rent affordability, value for money become much more central to the work that we'll be doing over the next 3 years.
Okay. Mary?
Thank you, Convener. The regulator is responsible for monitoring social landlords' progress towards meeting the Scottish Housing Quality Standard, and compliance has gone up. It was 82% in April 2013. There are 10 landlords that have reported that their houses may be at risk of not complying by 2015. So can I ask you two things? Why are those landlords at risk of not complying with the SHQS, and what work is the regulator doing to help them comply?
Michael's going to take that because he's got the details.
Okay. Our analysis has found that there are 20 landlords, 19 RSLs and 1 local authority that has reported through their annual returns in the Charter that in total just under 3,000 houses in Scotland would not meet the SHQS at the 31st of March 2015 target date. That equates to round about 0.5% of all social housing in Scotland that falls within the scope of SHQS. At this stage, we've had assurances from 11 of the 20 around the reasons for why they're not able to meet it by that deadline, and also on the plans that they have in place to address that shortfall. We're also following up with a further 9 landlords that have indicated that they won't be able to meet the standard. 6 of those have fewer than 80 houses that wouldn't meet the standard. So we'll engage with them in a proportionate way, reflecting the scale of the issue. Of the 3 remaining landlords, we anticipate at this point that 2 of them will be able to provide assurances that we need and we're continuing to work with them to get those assurances. One landlord we have an intensive engagement at the moment with, and our concern is that they are only at this point undertaking a stock condition survey to properly identify the level of compliance or non-compliance with the standard, and we're engaging with them on a number of other regulatory issues and concerns. Where a landlord doesn't meet the standard or doesn't continue to meet the standard after the 2015 deadline, we will consider the use of our statutory powers, and in particular we are looking at the role of enforcement notices as a way to address some of these concerns that might come through around non-compliance.
Can I just be clear, how many landlords then are at risk?
Well, 20 have indicated, but we have assurances from 11 of those that they have appropriate and deliverable plans in place that will meet the SHQS, perhaps not by the 31st of March, but fairly quickly thereafter.
Are in place that they will meet the standard fairly soon, you would monitor that?
Yes, absolutely.
And is it in a particular area in Scotland, or is it right across
No,
Scotland?
no, it's fairly geographically spread. The other factor that's obviously in play here is the role of exemptions and abeyances. The Scottish Government has put in place a framework where landlords could claim exemptions or abeyances against a set number of criteria. Now, in particular for abeyances, that's not a continuous or unending ability not to meet it. That's to recognise that there are circumstances where achievement of the target by the 31st of March may not be possible for justifiable reasons, and we'll continue to monitor those situations as well.
How many houses, how many properties have exemptions? Do you have an exact figure?
I don't have an exact figure here. We have figures based on the returns that came to us on the 31st of March, but exemptions the figures are likely to change before we get to the actual 31st of March 2015 date. But what we can do is provide the committee with that information.
Yeah, that would be useful. The regulator also monitors the energy efficiency standard for social housing. Could you explain a bit more about how you monitor and report on the new efficiency standards?
Yeah. So from 2015-16, the next financial year, we'll monitor and report on social landlords' compliance with the energy efficiency standard for social housing. We've already published technical guidance which sets out information on the approach to monitoring compliance, the arrangement for landlords reporting data to us on an annual basis, and the actual indicators that we will gather information on and that will make up that annual return. So social landlords will be working to achieve that standard by 2020, and landlords should give us their first return by the 31st of May 2016. And we'll use that data in the same way as we use the data from the annual return in the Charter. We'll assess the risks of non-compliance with that standard and determine what regulatory engagements are appropriate on the back of that assessment.
Mike, did you want to come in specifically on energy efficiency?
Yes, and before I ask the question, I should perhaps, in fairness, just say that I've got a pretty good understanding of Part 6 of the Building Standards, which, as you'll know, deal with energy efficiency. But I've had concerns raised with me from a number of social landlords saying that the concern is that some significant proportions of the work that they've done in order to reach the energy efficiency part of the 2015 standard may have to be kind of ripped out and redone to meet the next standard, which it will obviously be higher. And insulation is really just about thickness, and in these times of slender resources, it would be difficult to justify expenditures beyond the 2015 standard when they're trying to meet that. But there is a concern that a lot of work will have to be effectively just redone to meet the next standard? You mentioned technical guidance. Do you have any thoughts on this concern?
My understanding of the energy efficiency standard is that it actually builds on the requirements that are set out in the Scottish Housing Quality Standard, specifically with the aim of avoiding the potential for there being any situation where you would have to effectively undo work that had already been done to achieve this standard. Having said that, we're also aware, and this relates to some of the situations around exemptions or abeyances, or indeed some of those landlords that won't meet the Scottish Housing Quality Standard by 2015, because they had recognised that it would be more advantageous to their tenants and also make greater economic sense for them not to do the work to achieve the Scottish Housing Quality Standard, but instead reshift their focus to the energy efficiency standard, and therefore have plans in place that will deliver that sometime after the 31st of March 2015, and therefore technically they wouldn't be meeting the standard they're obliged to meet at that point. But it's with a very good reason, with an eye on the energy efficiency standard. So we're trying to be as pragmatic and proportionate in how we respond to those situations. But as I say, the Scottish Government, as I understand it, very much had in mind when they were developing the energy efficiency standard that it shouldn't result in situations where there was in effect work that was therefore redundant having been done under the Scottish Housing Quality Standard.
Okay, thank you.
Mary.
Thank you. Can I just ask you about the National Panel of Tenant and Service Users, which it gives you a mechanism to engage with people through surveys and focus groups and telephone interviews. Can you explain to the committee in a bit more detail how that works, and how you reach out to encourage people to engage?
I'll ask Lisa to major in that, because she was involved in the helping set up that arrangement, and she meets with the people also.
The National Panel is a really important part of our suite of tools that we can use to engage with people who are not already active within tenant movements. It was important for us to continue to engage with tenant activists through the defined RTOs, but also to try and get out into the wider tenant sector and speak to them about their experiences and perhaps not having been activists. We have used them recently. We've just had published the findings, or we've got the findings of our second survey about how they feel about what the priorities should be. And some of the things that has come up through that research are things that you probably wouldn't be surprised about, that the priorities for them are, how quickly can I get my repairs done, maintenance, can my landlord see me as an individual, and can they respond to me as an individual? These are the kind of things that we have used the panel to find out and clarify. So being able to identify what tenant priorities are informs how we then go forward and where we focus our regulation, because there's no point in us spending a lot of time and resource looking into things that actually don't matter to tenants, because at the end of the day we are here to protect the rights of tenants and service users. So the panel has been, it's still very young, we're still figuring out how we can use it going forward, but thus far what we've found out is, what are the priorities for people, and as I say, that it informs how we go forward.
So are the people on the tenant panel, are they a fixed group of people?
Well, they're a fixed group of people in the sense that so long as they're willing to be involved, then they are there. Some people, I think when we started off, we initially got somewhere around 350 people to sign up to it, and I think there was a drop-off of it never fell below the 300, but when some people get involved in it, they maybe weren't exactly clear on what the expectations were going to be. So it's fluid in the sense that people can participate in it or not, but for us, it's fixed. You know, it's a fixed and significant resource for us to actually use in, you know, different ways. We can use it to do broad surveys, but we can also use it to drill down into specific groups. You know, if we had work in a particular, you know, if we wanted to find out what older people feel, for example, then we can extract the information on who the older members of the panel are and target them in a much more significant way. So it's there to be used in a flexible way, but we think it provides you know, really interesting information.
How do you engage with people that aren't part of your panel? Because one of the concerns that's been raised at the informal meetings that we've had is that you speak to the usual suspects and you don't speak to anybody else. So how do you engage with people that are not part of the panel? And a lot of people are unaware, a lot of tenants are unaware of the panel and unaware of the work that the panel does. So how do you reach those people?
Well, the first thing I would do is hopefully provide you with some assurance that the national panel is not the usual suspects. It was specifically set up to, you know, identify people who would, you know, are receiving services from us either as tenants or, you know, other service users, and get beyond the usual suspects, because we understand that sometimes you can go from, you know, one organisation, one tenant group to another, and it's the same people. And although those people are incredibly knowledgeable, it's, you know, we need to have as diverse a pool as possible. As far as the, you know, getting our message out beyond the tenant panel, you know, that's something that we are, you know, really learning about just now. And I think things like the landlord report being published and going out through all the newsletters that landlords are providing actually lets people know that we exist and that we are an organisation that can be engaged with, should they wish to. Although there is sometimes some confusion, because, you know, people often get in touch with us to find out because they have a specific issue with their landlord. Now, that's not for us to deal with. There's a different process there. But we are always looking to you know, get out into the sector, and especially as board members, we've got an opportunity to go out into the public and actually tell people about what we do, what this organisation does.
And how do the tenant panel engage with the harder to reach tenants? Because there is also a concern that the tenant panel are, to use the phrase I used before, the usual suspects. And those usual suspects would use their usual suspects to get information. So how do you widen that out?
When we were setting up the tenant panel, we were aware of, you know, the potential for the tenant panel to be very quickly filled up by people who are already being engaged with, and the mechanisms that we used. People had an applications process. People were asked were they already engaged in the tenant movement, and that was not to exclude people. You know, that nobody was. We don't have a situation where we have a tenant panel where there are no other. There are no people who are already involved, but we wanted to provide some sort of balance. So that went back to the actual application process and at the very beginning. So I think we can always do more. There are always hard to reach groups. That doesn't matter whether you're a Scottish Housing Regulator or what public body you are. There are always underrepresented groups, and we seek to raise awareness. I mean, for example, we used Positive Action Housing to try and raise our profile within the BME community, so as that people could understand that, you know, again, there was a service here that were working to protect their rights. So, as much as any organisation can, we have identified where there are gaps in our tenant panel, and we try very hard to fill those gaps in the most appropriate way.
I mean, I think it's work in progress. we've started somewhere. It's much wider than the usual suspects, and as somebody that's not been with the regulator for terribly long, I was very aware of the people that I would have then put into the category of the usual suspects and people who. This was exciting because it was the first time they'd come along to something, and this was really important. The list isn't closed, let's put it that way. This is work in progress, and as we learn from this experience, and if we can find other ways of attracting people to volunteer, because it is important that it's volunteers, not conscripts, and that they can be invited to volunteer, then we would look at what size the panel, because we can use the panel in different ways. It's not, we don't need a room to allow 500 people to gather together necessarily at the one time. So it's to be flexible and don't close the door. If somebody came forward and said that they wished to be a member of a panel, they would be assessed and judged and offered the opportunity.
You have more or less answered my next question, which was, do you have some sort of review process of how well the panel is working?
Yes.
So,
and you know, my experience with previous panels, it takes time for this to bed down, and it is excruciatingly difficult to reach some people. And I mean, for example, in most other types of panels I've been involved in, to get young people can be really difficult unless you press the right button that then suddenly makes it exciting for more than just one. So these are the kind of things that we're all bringing the experience we have of different panels to bear on what we're trying to do with the regulator and see, can we get it better? But if you've got any tips.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Can I just ask, in terms of this whole role of tenant engagement and engagement with the wider community, one of the statutory objective of the regulator is to safeguard and promote the interests of current and future tenants, homeless people and other people who use services provided by social landlords. And so far no one has mentioned homeless people. So could you tell me if there are any ways, I recognise, as I'm sure the committee does, that this is a hard to reach group, but any ways in which you are engaging or seeking to engage with homeless people, perhaps those that are in temporary accommodation, and how you meet your requirement as a statutory objective to promote the interests of homeless people more generally?
We were very conscious that we maybe had not put as much of our attention onto homeless people as we have on the other parts of our regulatory business. So we did do the thematic study, which has now been published and has gone down very well and is now helping to form our thinking around how we take our activity associated with homelessness forward. But Michael, is there anything specifically you would like to add to that?
I think you're right. It's very difficult to engage with that particular group. We work with representative bodies such as Shelter, and we have regular liaison with them at both a strategic level, but also at a level where we look to obtain information and intelligence from them around what some of the issues may be that are playing out at a local level in particular. We have the charter information, which includes a range of performance information and data on landlords' delivery of services to homeless people. We undertook the thematic inquiry, and thematic inquiries is likely to be a vehicle that we look at again in terms of exploring further the quality of services that are delivered to this particular client group. Where we engage directly with a social landlord, and it will tend to be a local authority in this regard, it's at that point that we'll look to access, where we possibly can, any existing ways to engage directly with homeless people, including, as you touched on, those that might be resident in temporary accommodation at that time. That tends to be around a particular regulatory engagement with a particular landlord.
It's, 6 months since that report was published. What has actually changed since the report was published?
Well, positively, the Scottish Government and the Association of Local Authority Chief Housing Officers in COSLA undertook to develop guidance on the delivery of of housing options, which we saw as a major necessary development, and that is progressing. We are not directly involved in that. We will look at a further review of housing options and how it's being delivered at an appropriate time in the future that would enable us to understand whether any guidance that come forward has been effective in addressing the issues that we raised through that thematic study.
Mr Jarvie, you'll know from your previous life how slowly sometimes the wheels of government can turn.
Thank you for reminding me.
Can you shed any light on the progress that's been made in terms of publishing the guidance?
I think with the working with others, this is where stakeholder involvement is even more important, because we can't, we don't deliver the service ourselves, so we need to speak to those who do deliver services for these people, and we've been doing that. So I mean, it will take a while, but I interacted with Shelter just the other week there to see how.
That it will take a while. I was afraid you would say that.
Well, it is a difficult area, and it is local authorities by and large who have got this responsibility. So linking with them, which is what we do, that we assess them in the same way as we assess the RSLs. And in that context, we pick up whether there are issues. And if there are issues, we interact with them. Because there were 2 last year, I think it was, that there were some hiccups around the provision of housing, particularly as we moved towards the winter and the festive period. And the dialogue was very effective and fruitful, and those particular situations were resolved for then. But we're on the case. I think it's really important. I think that thematic study gave us the momentum that we needed in order to think through how to take this forward.
James?
Thank you, Convener. In your annual report, you said that most RSLs are well governed and financially healthy. I wonder if you could expand on just how well the RSLs are governed and the state of their financial health.
I think you should deal with that one. But I mean, the answer is yes. I mean, the number that we interact with are few compared to the overall number of RSLs. So on the whole, it is good, it's healthy, it's robust. I suppose what we would like to see more of is those who are really doing a really good job being seen as doing a good job by other RSLs, so that if they begin to falter in any way, they perhaps seek some kind of relationship and link with another RSL that's doing their business efficiently and effectively, and get the support that they need before it becomes a regulatory matter.
Is there a role for you in a kind of sharing of best practice?
Yes, and we do that. We do distribute best practice. But again, these are all things that we're thinking to develop further as we begin to get better at communicating. Michael?
I mean, I think it's worth saying that our view is that social housing is a generally stable sector with many strengths, including in the areas of governance. And where we find that there may be governance issues that we have to engage with the landlord, most landlords work with us cooperatively to address those issues. In terms of the dissemination of learning out of that, our Governance Matters series of publications is an important way for us to help RSLs understand where some of the pitfalls may be and to enable them to look to themselves and understand whether they are well placed to deal with those types of issues and risks that might emerge. I think we are encouraging other bodies to be more prominent in the provision of good practice in this area, and also to encourage them to look at what mechanisms they can put in place to offer peer support to organisations that may be experiencing difficulties, so that it's not necessarily the case that that will then become a regulatory matter.
Can I just take you on from something you said about challenges that RSLs are facing? You're engaging with an increasing number of RSLs, I believe, according to the report. Could you tell me what specific challenges are RSLs facing that maybe they weren't facing a couple of years ago?
Yeah, I think the environment that landlords are operating in is undoubtedly becoming more challenging. We have, which I'm sure is well understood by the committee, the developments in welfare reform, which present many challenges for social landlords. Pension liabilities are an increasingly significant issue that landlords are having to deal with and present a regulatory concern. Looking at some of the requirements around achieving standards, both in the Charter, EISH, Scottish Housing Quality Standard, bring additional requirements on landlords. Looking at that all together, it's undoubtedly the case that there will be a need for landlords to have a constant eye to their costs, to their efficiency and their effectiveness. That's why, as I think one of my colleagues mentioned earlier, we'll have an increasing focus over the next few years around value for money.
Ask then, you brought up the issue of welfare reforms. What sort of impact are you seeing that having on rent arrears for RSLs?
We undertook some research last year on welfare reform, and we did see that there had been an early impact. I think the actions by the Scottish Government around discretionary housing payments has definitely had a mitigating effect on the impact on social landlords. But of course, that's only in relation to those elements of welfare reform that I have currently brought in. We're looking further ahead and asking landlords to look at their business plans with an eye to the types of pressures that will come when the full range of welfare reforms start to impact on them, and in particular universal payment, and in particular the direct payment element of universal credit.
And what role would you have in that and trying to assist the RSLs to deal with the impact? I know you can't assist them financially, but to trying to help them to prepare for the impact of universal credit, because I believe there was a letter from the housing associations, tenants organisations, etc., went to the Secretary of State for DWP opposing that. Would you say that that is sort of a universal position for the RSLs?
I think in general RSLs and local authority landlords would look at welfare reform as a development which is not necessarily helping them deliver services to their tenants. They recognise the challenges that there will be around rent collection, ensuring that they have that well-established income stream that enables them to then go on and deliver for their tenants. So certainly from my experience, it's fairly consistent, the feedback that we would get from landlords in that regard.
Okay, thanks very much.
David.
Thank you, Convener. I note from your annual report that financial health is obviously a key priority for you. But why are you saying to social landlords that above inflation rent increases are sustainable?
Firstly, I would say we've not said that above inflation rent increases are not sustainable. What we have done is called for a national debate on rent affordability. Now, this recognises that landlords, until very recently, operated in a world where incomes rose and the benefits and taxation system provided a certain safety net for tenants' incomes. But that world is changing, and it's imperative that landlords reflect that world is changing and the new pressures and risks that it brings. So the new context and also the findings from our analysis of financial projections provided by landlords mean that rent affordability is already and likely to become ever more so a key issue for tenants. So we've called for that national debate around the sustainability of current rent increase assumption in landlords' business plans, the majority of which our assessment showed that 2/3 of registered social landlords have a rent assumption of RPI +1 for the foreseeable future. So we've challenged landlords to consider if they're content to allow costs to tenants to continue to increase above inflation year on year, does that risk locking increasing numbers of tenants into a reliance on benefits? Are they content that they've done everything they possibly can do to minimise any increase that they ask of tenants? Do they give tenants genuine options and choices during rent consultations? Have they had a mature dialogue with their tenants about costs versus service levels? And are they clear on what they would consider affordable rents in their set of circumstances? So we expect landlords to consider tenants' ability to pay rent and to keep paying rent over the longer term when they're looking at decisions on rent increases. That call for a debate has generally been well received, and indeed the Chartered Institute of Housing had taken forward the progressing of that discussion and debate.
Surely social landlords are in the best position to make these decisions. You said earlier in evidence that it's not for us to run RSL's businesses, but surely that's what you're doing if you're dictating effectively what the rent levels above inflation are to be.
Can I, for the avoidance of doubt, restate, we are not dictating rent levels. We are not suggesting what those rent levels should be. What we are asking landlords to do is to consider tenants' ongoing ability to pay rent when they are determining what rent levels they set in their business plans.
But surely that's obvious, and any social landlord worth its salt would do that. They are closer to their tenants than you are.
Well, what we found through our analysis is that 2/3 of them have assumptions that they will deliver RPI plus 1% rent increases for the foreseeable future. So we're asking them to reconsider that and to determine whether that is sustainable.
Without getting into technical discussion, clearly RPI is not the index that many organisations will now use. I mean, CPI is the normal index, for example, for pension increases. Is that a technical discussion you've had with social landlords?
We've had the discussion of the divergence between RPI and CPI and whether the landlords will need to adjust their thinking on which index they actually use as their starting point, not least because benefit increases have shifted to CPI, although now they're coming under even more pressure in terms of the increases that are happening in that area. So we're saying to landlords, look at the sustainability of the assumptions you're making around rent increases. We've not gone beyond that because, as you say, it's quite right that it's for landlords to determine in dialogue with their tenants what appropriate rent levels should be. And that opens up a broader debate, I think, that needs to be had around value for money and the level of services that tenants would expect for an appropriate amount of rent that they're paying.
Just for avoidance of doubt for me, I'm not obviously doubting your statutory obligation as a regulator. I'm merely making the point that surely any social landlord would obviously want to discuss tenants before they look at rent increases.
And most social landlords do, but what we have found is that 2/3 of them have a locked down RPI plus 1% rent assumption in their business plans. And what we're saying at this point is we think they need to have a think about that, a discussion with their tenants about whether that is sustainable. Because there's simple arithmetic in play here. If tenants' incomes are not increasing significantly, if they're not increasing above RPI, and rent assumptions are increasing at RPI plus, then rents will become less affordable.
On then to a second question. You'll know that we've had some evidence on your Governance Matters publications, which there's been 3 recently. One view was that they present a perception sector that they would seek to avoid, and they're consistently negative. How would you respond to that?
Hear what they're saying and understand what they're saying. And I think this is part of the earlier dialogue we had about tone, about getting closer to people, getting to understand people better. And that is something that we're looking at as far as our publications are concerned, because it's really interesting that the feedback about the events around governance matters that were put on for the board members or management team members were very, very positive. And some of our board members attended some of those, and it was quite an interesting and I think enlightening experience. So it's not about what we're trying to do around governance matters. There's some disparity between what they think we do with the written word versus what we do with the spoken word. And I think we are paying particular attention to that at the moment, not just to do with the Governance Matters publication, but all our publications in general. And that's why, of the things that are going to be going out in the first part of this year, we're in a consultation exercise about that. And it is about, have we got the tone right? Is the message being conveyed in the correct way? So we're on the case.
Right. Well, that's good to hear, because I think you made rightly the point earlier that you require some evidence. Well, so what I'm saying is I'm giving you some evidence from what we've received. Is there certainly a view that it is an unduly negative tone?
Yes.
And perhaps if you could look at that, that would be
well,
very helpful.
We're already on that case.
The final question, Convener, is why is there a requirement for an option appraisal when a senior officer is leaving or retiring from a registered social landlord?
We've actually been doing quite a bit of work this year, and much of it has been listening activity. We are very, very clear that there are things that we would like to phrase differently, that we would like to give the message a different twist, if you like, and we are consulting on that. And in particular, we are working with the Federation and the Forum, trying to get our documentation around this more appropriate, shall we say.
Reading through your civil service speak on this one, you are reviewing this with the possibility of changing this.
Well, we are looking at, I think what will come out of this is that we will be looking at the business plan. And if the business plan is robust, well thought through, then we would expect that everything that's in that plan will be enacted at the time that somebody moves on.
Seems to be certainly a very sensible approach.
Yeah.
So, irrespective of a director of a registered social landlord leaving, if the business plan is intact and very, very good, it doesn't really matter at one level who takes over.
No.
But that's certainly very positive. And the final point, Convener, is I was very surprised to hear that you suggest that certain consultants be used to carry out this option appraisal. Again, that to me does seem quite top-down centralising. Could you explain why this has been suggested, and in the review, is this a possibility this could be removed and leave it for ourselves themselves to decide which consultants they use? It is a free market, after all.
Michael?
Yeah, special managers provide an invaluable service to organisations that are experiencing some difficulty. They can stabilise the organisation, they can keep business as usual going for tenants and other service users, and they can also lead the rescue of the organisation from within the RSL. It's probably worth looking at numbers we're talking about here. Since April 2012, 11 RSLs have commissioned or appointed a special manager. So we're looking at probably less than 5 a year where this happens. We work cooperatively with those organisations, and where they've recognised the need to appoint a special manager, we can assist them with the provision of names of individuals that we are aware have had a track record in delivering that type of service. And where we are and where time allows, we can provide more than one name. It's not the case that we would require those organisations to take a particular consultant, but what we will look for is where we are engaging with them because there's a regulatory concern, we will want to have assurance that the individual being employed has the necessary skills, track record and experience to be able to deliver.
So if an RSL require a consultant and they decide they're appointing their own consultant, you don't have any veto over this?
If we aren't engaging with them on a regulatory concern, then no. And landlords will appoint consultants very regularly, and we will have no involvement in that process whatsoever.
No, I was meaning if there's a regulatory concern.
Well, if there is a regulatory concern and they look to appoint somebody and we are content that that individual has the necessary skills and track record to deal with the issue in hand, then no, we wouldn't have any concerns there.
Okay, so if there's a regulatory concern and a registered social landlord appoint a consultant without reference to you and you don't think they've got the necessary skills, you do have a veto of the consultant?
I wouldn't describe it as a veto. We would engage with the landlord and we would discuss what our requirements are as a regulator, very much again with that focus on protecting the interests of tenants and other service users. That's the sole basis on which we would engage with the landlord. We would happily go along with any consultant that a landlord was appointed where we were clear that they had those necessary skills and experience. If we weren't content on that, then we would have a further dialogue with the landlord.
And if there's an impasse on that dialogue, who has the final word on this?
Well, at the end of the day, it's for landlords themselves to appoint these individuals. If we continued to have a concern and it was so significant and serious, then it may be that we would have to look at use of our statutory intervention powers.
All right. Right. Thank you for that.
This is about not just business as usual. This is about when there are problems. And so the track record is not about can you run a business. It's about can you run a business in trouble and turn it round. And so that's the really important thing that we need to get a mutual agreement about.
Thank you for that, Convener.
James, you have a supplementary.
Yeah, I accept what you're saying. I completely accept what you're saying, Mr. Jarvie. But the information we got last week is the exact opposite of what you've just told us there just now. We were told that there is a set amount of consultants to pick from, and that they have to pick from those consultants, named consultants that they have to pick from those named consultants. And I've been informed since then by a number of RSLs that none of them are based in this country. That just seems madness, because it's what we're looking for here are people who know the sector as much as anything else. Now, if what you said to David is correct, that the RSLs can go and pick a consultant and they have to fulfil certain criteria, then that's fine. But the criteria must be wide enough that it doesn't just involve 3 companies. And it must be wide enough that there are people in this country that have the skills and the experience to be able to do it.
There is undoubtedly a reality that there isn't a very well developed market in Scotland for people with these types of skills. We're aware of 2 or 3 individuals and they have been used and used quite extensively in this regard, who are Scottish based. We would look at the sole criteria of do they have the appropriate skills and track record of working in an organisation that is in crisis and being able to take that organisation out of crisis. That's the sole criteria we would look to in terms of whether we were content that somebody had the right individual to take that organisation forward.
Well, we have that in the record now, and the RSLs can refer to that in the future.
Well, when you talk about an organisation that's in crisis, because one of the concerns that was raised just last week is about a senior officer leaving and that being a notifiable event. And we were certainly told last week that a well-run organisation, as a matter of course, when a senior officer leaves, would review their business and carry out all the necessary reviews that they would need to do, which would mean that it would not be a notifiable event. Because they're doing a kind of standard review of where the business is and what changes they need to make. The concern is where it is a senior manager that leaves and the business is not in any problem. There's no danger in the RSL. The RSL is not at risk and not at threat. That then becomes a notifiable event, and they are then put in the position, as James rightly said, where they are given a list of consultants that they must pick from. They are not in crisis. A senior manager has left. That's not a crisis in every situation.
Where an organisation is in a situation where a senior officer is leaving, our current guidance as it stands says that that's a notifiable event. Now, that means nothing other than they need to notify us that their senior officer is leaving. We then have to we need to then consider whether there's a basis on which we have to engage with that landlord. If we are content or satisfied that the landlord has good succession planning in place, has an appropriate up-to-date business plan, then that will be the end of the matter. It's where that's not transparent or clear that we would have further engagement. And it's probably worth looking at the evidence in this. Over 3 years, 25 organisations have notified us of a chief executive's resignation. And following those organisations' consideration of their option, 18 of them have gone on to appoint a new chief executive. So a fairly straightforward process in that regard. 7 decided at that point, following their own delivered option appraisal, that they would join a group structure of another RSL. 4 of those because they identified that they didn't have a viable future in terms of their financial projections. So I think that gives some sense of the scale and the outcomes that flow from these processes.
And can I just reiterate that we are working on this with the Federation and with the Forum, and there will be guidance going out, information being distributed after we've deliberated this.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike?
Thank you, Convener. And before I get on to the questions, I would like to just go back to briefly to the discussion about sustainable rent increases. And you mentioned 2/3 of organisations are using RPI +1, and you seem to suggest that's a good thing. But actually, that raises some concerns with me, given that there's a great variation in local housing markets, and also I can think of a number of areas in the region I represent characterised by very low wages. Surely local flexibility is absolutely critical here, and I just wondered what your view is. Does your thinking incorporate a degree of flexibility?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the very point we are making. Right. I think it's critically important that landlords don't use a very formulaic approach to increasing their rent, that they look at it, they look at what tenants can afford, they look at their local market, they look at the rent level they have at the moment, because we don't have a single rent level in Scotland. Some landlords will have significantly lower levels of rent at the moment, and therefore will have more capacity to increase their rent than some other landlords. But what we're saying is, look at your assumptions, look at what your tenants will be able to afford over the longer term, and make rent decisions appropriately.
I'm sorry to say you worry me even further now, just because historical rent levels have been low. There may be very good reasons for that. That does not necessarily imply huge latent capacity for increasing rent.
No,
surely
it doesn't.
Not.
It doesn't. What I'm saying is landlords need to look at this in the round. They need to consider all the information they have. They need to, in particular, and this is very much about our statutory objective to protect the interests of tenants, they must consider their tenants' ongoing ability to continue to pay rent and use that as a clear factor in determining what rent level increases they should be applying.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Are you able to comment in terms of giving an overview about the confidence of investors to invest in social housing?
Yep.
There's been quite a bit of interaction this last 18 months with lenders and others that produce funds, if you like, that our landlords can have access to. And Michael's been involved in meetings with groups of these people, so he's got the detail.
Yeah. And giving confidence to lenders and investors in social housing is one of our 5 key strategic objectives. And that's recognising that there's over £4 billion of investment in social housing by private lenders and investors. And those lenders and investors are telling us that our effective and robust regulation is a critical factor in their decisions to lend and invest. And that the confidence that they currently have in the sector is in part a result of the approach that we take to regulation. Last year we had the first ever private placement by a Scottish RSL to the value of £45 million. We also had the first ever own name bond issued by a Scottish RSL. And I think that's evidence of the confidence that lenders and investors have in the social housing sector in Scotland. And recently, as Anne touched on earlier in the opening statement, one of the major lenders to the sector told us that our effective regulation is worth round about 115 basis points to the lending. Now, if you extrapolate that across the total lending that's there for RSLs, that amounts to an annual saving of about £40 million to social landlords in terms of the confidence that lenders have in the sector. And part of that is the confidence that lenders have in our approach to regulation.
Great. I mean, that's obviously good news, but there's another side to that coin, and I wonder if you're able to comment on it. And it's something that I increasingly became aware after the credit crunch of what I would describe as very sharp practice on the part of banks when lending to this sector. I mean, really sharp practice, and I won't name the banks here today, but I may consider doing so in the future. Do you have a view on that?
I think it's almost certainly the case that the relationships that landlords have with their lenders are ever more important, given some of the pressures that there undoubtedly are on lenders themselves and internally in terms of what their own risk committees might, their own credit committees, might expect from these. And there is some pressure around repricing within the sector. Having said that, I think the key lenders to this sector are still there, still prepared to lend, are keen to work with the associations to get a sustainable position. That's our general experience today. And it's probably worth saying that in the 2 statutory intervention cases that we've delivered over the last month or so, we worked very hard with the lenders involved. And I'm pleased to say that generally they've been part of the solution to those situations. They worked effectively with us. So yes, there is some pressure in there, but I think sometimes it's overstated. Most landlords continue to have good working relationships with their lenders.
And, I mean, you kind of anticipated my last question in this area when you talked about bonds. Obviously, that's a very interesting development. Are you aware? Are you trying to stimulate perhaps other potential sources of investment in social housing? I mean, we see things like crowdfunding, in other sectors. I'm often reminded that where we are now is reminiscent of the very early days of the building society movement and so on. And yet some of the social landlords we talked to last week complained to us that your effect was was to prevent innovation in as much as innovative ideas that they were seeking to take forward and develop, you perhaps were not as open as you might be because you were perhaps a bit risk averse. Do you think that's a fair comment? And if it's not, are you trying to develop and promote other innovative financial models?
Well, if I take the last point first, I think if you refer to our annual report, you'll see some quotes from landlords, from one landlord in particular, around the role we had in the first private placement that's happened with a social landlord in Scotland. If you also have reference to the published report by the ratings agency Standards & Poor on the first named bond issuance by Scottish RSL, you'll see the view of the regulator in that. I think we'd all agree that RSLs have been amongst the most innovative of organisations over the last 3 decades or so, and they've been regulated throughout that time. And of course, there are many organisations out there innovating at the moment. And we have a significant role seeing what they do over considering business plans, looking to grant consent for work that they're looking to do. So you'll not be surprised to hear that I don't buy into the assertion that the regulator stifles innovation. Nor, I think, should we apologise for undertaking the role that this Parliament gave us, which is to provide a series of checks and balances that ensure that the interests of tenants and other service users are protected at all time. So we will always consider the business case provided by a registered social landlord when it's considering a new venture. And I would say, Freudian slip, or a new funding model. And critically, I think it's important to remember that we, as a regulator, ask for nothing more than that organisation's own board or management committee should be asking for.
Thank you very much. You've reassured me.
Adam. Thank you, Convener. Could I ask you to outline the main findings from the communications research that you commissioned, you mentioned in your opening remarks, Ms Jarvie, and perhaps more to the point, what changes you've made as a result of the report's recommendation?
Lisa's on the case, so she'll share her thoughts with you.
Well, maybe if I just start with the piece of research that we did, which involved 270 of our stakeholder organisations. We wanted to find out how they felt about how we communicate. And we found primarily the stakeholders have a strong awareness of us, of what we do and the fact that we are here and the reasons why we do things. We found also that they were largely positive about the website, about our corporate publications and things like our regular electronic newsletter, the SHR update. They felt that our main regulatory publications were generally good and that we were covering the right topics. However, some had mixed views about some of the regulatory publications. So what we did was we used the results of that to understand the areas where we had strengths and areas where we could perhaps further enhance our approach. And some of the specific things that we've done as a consequence of that research are we have increased the frequency of our SHR updates, and also when we have significant or relevant publications about to come out, we have trailed them an awful lot better. So that's one piece of communications research we did. I touched on earlier the research that we did with our national panel. Again, the key findings were, not surprising, repairs, value for money, but also most tenants felt that they were well informed about how their landlords were performing, and also they had a strong interest in continuing to be communicated with that information. We had a similar but separate piece of research with the RTOs, and again, not dissimilar to the register, the national panel, again, service quality, repairs and maintenance, these were the key areas that people were interested in finding out more information about. So we use all of these pieces of communications research to help us shape, for example, the upcoming consultation on revisions to some of our regulatory guidance. And also, we, as a regulator, we want to communicate efficiently and effectively. So if we are finding out that perhaps the people require some clarity when we are communicating, then that's something that we take on board just day to day and try and improve on. So I think the communications research has been incredibly useful to give us assurance that, you know, most of the things that we are doing correct. But we're a learning organisation. We would never assume that everything that we do is perfect or that we communicate in a perfect way. We always look to improve where we can.
Well, thank you for that comprehensive response. Can I change the subject to the challenges that the regulator is facing itself from a declining budget. Could you perhaps articulate some of those challenges for us?
I'm happy to answer,
okay,
answer
well,
that. Yeah, I mean, like most public sector bodies, we recognise the challenges there are in terms of the funding position. We are fortunate that in this current financial year and for next financial year, we've had a very modest increase in our funding. Our funding position is still significantly below what it was 3-4 years ago, and we've effectively taken out about 40% of the cost from our organisation over the last 4 years. And we recognise that there will be continuing pressure on our funding over the next 3-4 years. One of the ways that we will respond to that is by continuously looking at ways that we can work smarter, more efficiently, more effectively. But we also recognise that there's only so much you can squeeze out of that approach. So we will also have a very close eye to prioritisation and ensuring that our resources are going where they are most needed. We're clear that that may mean on occasion that we're not able to do everything that everyone would want us to do. But we'll have to be very clear on the basis for that prioritisation, and hopefully that we'll be able to, through the types of engagement that we've touched on already, be very clear on what our stakeholders' priorities are, and they're trying to marry those two positions up. But I think we're very clear that this is going to be a challenging period over the next 3 or 4 years.
Could I just reassure the committee that the board are very aware of the situation, are on the case and consider at every meeting if there are any proposals for things that should be taken forward or not. We're very clearly debated and decisions taken at the end whether or not this is affordable or not. And that will continue throughout the year. Absolutely clear. And also we've already started thinking through what kind of priority list we would have if we really got to that point, and that dialogue's ongoing.
Okay. So that 40% you talk about in terms of taking costs out, that obviously involved a reduction in the staffing resources available to you. Are you confident going forward you can still achieve your mission, as it were, with the levels of staff that you have or are likely to have over the next period?
We are reasonably confident that the level of resource we have at this time enables us to address the priorities that we've set out in our corporate plan. We'll be renewing our corporate plan in April, and we'll have obviously a clear eye to the resource position when we're considering the priorities that we set out then. At this point, we obviously, as with every other part of the public sector, we're not aware of what the funding settlement's likely to be beyond the next financial year. So it's quite challenging to have any more robust approach to financial planning in that regard. But yes, as things stand, we're confident that we can do the job that the Parliament has given us to do.
We did a restructuring about 18 months, 2 years ago, to help us to focus and to be able to do our business in a more efficient way. And so that's allowing Michael to make the statement that he's just made to you as far as the present time's concerned. But when we hear what the next settlement is, then we will be having another debate, I would imagine.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Mike.
Thank you, Convener. I return to a kind of theme of the earlier discussion, which was about trust, because there's no doubt about it in an informal session last week. I think all of us formed a distinct impression that there was certainly work to be done to improve trust. And one of the things that was discussed was whether or not there are lessons from the justice system so that the concepts like the presumption of innocence, the right to know what the complaint is, what the charge is, what you're being accused of, and one or two of the people pointed out that might actually save a lot of time and resource. If RSLs being investigated knew what was concerning you, they might be able to supply perfectly reasonable answers very quickly, and so the whole exercise would consume less resource on both parties. But I suppose the thing that seemed to have most traction was the idea that there ought to be some kind of appeal. And I can see merits in that, not in a vexatious way, not in a way that's against the interests of yourselves as regulators, but as a way that by introducing that moral hazard for your own people might help to drive your standards upward as well. How do you feel about the idea of an appeal?
Yeah. I think I should say, first of all, that we have a complaints procedure at the moment that can be used if people feel that they have got something about how we've gone about our business that they don't think was done either within our statutory framework or for whatever the reason. So they could use the complaints procedure. I think we would all applaud an appeal system, providing we have time to consider it seriously, and that's the position the board's in at the moment, because we do know that the Code of Practice for all Scottish regulators includes a requirement to have an independent appeals process for a regulatory system, but it's quite broad brush the way it's stated, and it doesn't give us a clear focus as to exactly what the expectation would be. So I think the important thing would be, and can I link this to the resource issue? Because, nothing's without a cost, unfortunately, and time, above all, is a cost. So we would like to look at this and see, what it means for SHR, and what could we do that would be proportionate and would be meaningful. So we can say amen to the need for some kind of system. It's what the system would be that doesn't just cause further bureaucracy, because you could end up having as many people disaffected with an appeals procedure as you've got currently saying they want one at the moment. If we make it so cumbersome that they don't understand that, we perhaps make too much of it or whatever.
Absolutely accept these things have to be carefully considered and that you're under resource pressure, but I'm sure it would be of interest to the committee that, given that you seem to agree with the concept, could you put a time frame on over what period would you like to consider this?
I'll need to speak to the man
and maybe report back to the committee when you'd concluded your considerations. Yeah.
Absolutely, we could commit to do that. We are in dialogue with the Scottish Government at the moment around the timeframes for the implementation of the strategic code of practice for all regulators and what the implications of that are in terms of putting in place the requirements set out in that code, the vast majority of which we already comply with and meet. But it does have this requirement for an independent appeal process. So first and foremost, we need to understand what that actually means in terms of is it entirely independent of us, and therefore it wouldn't be for us to take forward the delivery of that particular appeal mechanism. So there's some things we need to work through in that, but absolutely we can commit to the committee to come back with what the plan would be for the achievement of an appropriate appeal process in due course.
Yeah,
thank
you. Sorry.
Just to say that the board is committed to having a debate about this when Michael has finished his discussion with Scottish Government, and we know exactly what this is, rather than sitting there and worrying about what it might be, because it is important that we get clarity and we understand what the expectations are.
Yeah.
If I could just make a comment on that as well, if you don't mind. As a regulator, our statutory objective is to protect the rights of tenants and other service users. And our concerns would be around our ability to actually do that. And I'm talking not about the day-to-day regulatory work that we do, but those significant crisis points. So any appeals process, we would not wish to be prevented from protecting those tenants, and in order to make interventions very quickly to save the you know, organisations from, for example, becoming insolvent. So there's a balancing act there. Although we completely understand the desire for organisations to have an appeals process, at the same time we must balance that about our ability to actually do the work that Parliament has asked us to do.
I absolutely understand that, but thank you for explaining it so nicely. My final question, you may be relieved to hear, last question, is on a different subject, but it's one that I think representing the Highlands and Islands is of concern, and I'm sure it's of concern to Mr Stewart as well. And it's about concerns around the policy of not allowing RSL staff and board members to, for instance, use the same contractors as the RSL employs, and a feeling that that's overly restrictive, particularly in rural areas. And I have also noticed in my casework that this has an impact on procurement and so on as well, and that in rural areas you'll often find that everybody's somebody else's brother, cousin, friend, relative of some sort, and these issues can be particularly difficult. Do you recognise that problem in rural areas? Do you feel that you know, policies that might be perfectly appropriate and workable in urban and city areas may not work and cause real difficulties in rural areas?
I absolutely empathise with what you're saying about rural areas. I know that in the past I used to go to various meetings and I kept bumping into the same people, and yet I thought I was going to quite a different topic and about different organisations, so I recognise that. But Michael has got the history of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to start by saying that the hard-earned good reputation of social landlords has been built on decades of regard to the highest of ethical standards. And that includes the effective identification and management of conflicts of interest. So it's very much about tenant, public and political perceptions of and the reputational damage that a poor perception can cause. So we believe that landlords should have clear and unambiguous codes of conduct and policies on payments and benefits for governing bodies and staff that set out the highest of standards. We then think that landlords can use the comply or explain principle to deal with situations that may be particularly individual to a locality or are you know, unique situations. And this is a well-used approach in many different sectors, and it avoids the potential to have what might be viewed as overly relaxed provisions or set those standards at a much lower level, while still accommodating the unusual or individual circumstances that you touched on. So we have to recognise that board members and staffs in RSLs are in a position of influence, and I think we would all agree that it's important for the good reputation of the sector that they do not benefit personally or inappropriately from those positions. So we don't consider it's appropriate for board members and staff members to make personal use of the same contractor or suppliers which are used by the RSL. However, we do recognise that there are particular circumstances for some rural and island RSLs, and in exceptional circumstances we can see that the RSL would need to have a procedure or a process that accommodated the exceptions that might have to be made where there is a good reason for staff, board members or connected persons using a supplier that is working with the RSL. So our position is that it would be improper for RSL staff and board members to benefit personally from their privileged position within the RSL, but that in particular circumstances where there's that very limited pool of suppliers or contractors, that the RSL should have a process to manage transparently that situation. And that's absolutely where comply or explain comes in. So set the highest of standards possible, but then use comply or explain to deal with individual circumstances.
Is there in this, I mean, I'm not aware of this comply or explain process, but I haven't come across it, but is there does it contain paragraphs off the shelf guidance, as it were, that could be used in the type of circumstances I'm describing? Or can you provide a template policy guidance for RSLs that find themselves in this situation? Because it seems to me from those that I've spoken to, and that I've spoken to a number on this issue, that they're kind of at sea, not just because they're islands, but they're at sea in terms of how they deal with this. So surely this is something that you can provide more specific, concrete guidance on, that gives them some surety when they're trying to deal with what can be difficult situations.
Well, we're currently in dialogue with the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations about its development of a model policy position. We are suggesting that it should be, as I've set out, set the highest of standards, and that's what is in place for every landlord. But that we utilise the comply or explains principle that says where a landlord finds there are exceptional circumstances where it's not possible to comply with that high standard, that it sets that out clearly, explains it, and it manages that situation very transparently. I think that gives us the best solution in these circumstances.
Thank you.
And that work has already started with the Federation.
Again, then, could I ask you just to write to the committee and you know, inform us when that work's come to fruition?
Yes.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Now, Joan McAlpine has been waiting very patiently throughout our deliberations this morning. I'm going to invite her now to ask some questions.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I'm going to go back to the issues of intervention that Mr Johnson and others raised earlier. I think it's important to make the point that the interventions are paid for by the housing associations, whether or not they initiate them, and therefore it's tenants who really pick up the bill for interventions in the end. Now, you'll be aware of the stories in the press about your interventions with Loreburn Housing Association in Dumfries and Galloway, and I have also, as a South of Scotland MSP, done quite a lot of work in this in the past, and had been approached by people, former members of the board, who were extremely concerned about the interventions. Now, your interventions with Loreburn started in 2011. At that time, Loreburn had satisfaction ratings amongst its tenants of 97%, which is one of the highest in the country. And in terms of benchmarking, which Lisa talked about earlier, against the peer group average, for example, emergency repairs, 99% of emergency repairs were met on time. So it was a very well-performing housing association, didn't have any financial issues and no complaints from tenants. And your intervention started as a result of the board taking legal advice to remove 3 of its members. Your intervention has gone on for the last 4 years and has cost Loreburn Housing Association more than £400 million in consultants and legal fees. £400 million is the estimate of your interventions. Now, that includes consultants who, contrary to what Mr Cameron said earlier, were imposed on the first consultant, Anderson Consulting, was imposed on the Housing Association. They didn't have a choice. It wasn't put out to tender. These consultants charge £900 a day, £1,000 a day. The Housing Association had no control over them. Now, one of the consultants was based part-time in Singapore, and the other consultant was based in Exeter. I would like you to tell me if you think that your actions in Loreburn were proportionate, and whether you think tenants have been given value for money in terms of your interventions in Loreburn.
Can I say that, yes, I think our actions in Loreburn were proportionate and appropriate, and have resolved what was a very challenging governance situation in that organisation. And I think if you speak to Loreburn today, they would confirm that outcome for you. I think in terms of the cost of interventions, where an organisation is in crisis, there will inevitably be a cost to tackle that. I could starkly put it as failure costs. It comes with a cost. But where we are involved in these organisations, what we do see is that the cost of a special manager coming in, for example, is usually repaid quite significantly in terms of the savings that are generated to that organisation over the medium or longer term.
How could a consultant based in Singapore manage a housing association in Dumfries and Galloway?
Well, I mean, obviously it's difficult for me to talk about specific individual cases. I know that when that particular consultant was appointed by the association, she was based in Scotland. She subsequently moved and then tailed off her engagement with the association, and a new special manager came in. But what I would say, I mean, if the committee is concerned about the situation in Lordburn, I'd perhaps suggest that they talk to Lordburn.
Well, as you'll be aware, that there are a number of people who were so unhappy with your actions at Lordburn that they left the board, and obviously we can't go into issues about individuals, but you'll be aware that there have been changes in staff as well at Lordburn. You talked about crisis and you know, serious failings. If there was if it was a serious issue and a crisis, why didn't you invoke your statutory powers?
We will use our statutory powers where it's appropriate for us to use our statutory powers and necessary. The committee of that particular association was prepared to cooperate with us and work with us to determine a way through the difficulties that they were experiencing. And it's appropriate for us to ensure that we use the most proportionate response possible to us. Indeed, that's a requirement placed upon us by the legislation passed by this Parliament, that we do that. So it is appropriate that we use, if you like, the lowest level of intervention that's possible by us to ensure that we are discharging that duty to be wholly appropriate, where we proportionate in the work that we do. So in this set of circumstances, it wasn't necessary for us to use our statutory intervention powers. We will use them where we consider it appropriate and necessary.
Do you ever threaten RSLs with statutory intervention powers in order to get them to cooperate with you?
Well, we will set out for organisations quite rightly and as clearly as possible what the implications will be for them if they're not able to give us the level of assurance that we need that they're tackling the issues. Now, that may mean that we have to say, if we can't get that level of assurance, it may require us to start to use statutory interventions. Now, we have those discussions as openly as we possibly can with landlords, so they understand the basis on which we're engaging with them, and what we will require to see them do to ensure that we have an appropriate level of assurance that the interests of tenants and other service users are being protected.
Again, to go back to the issues of crisis and, you know, the serious nature of the situation merited this huge amount of tenants' money being spent. Actually, Lordburn regulation plans say that your regulation plans say that the engagement level with Lordburn was only ever categorised as medium, not high. So that's not a crisis, is it?
Well, the level of engagement in part reflects the level of cooperation that we receive from the organisation. In that set of circumstances, the committee of Lordburn Housing Association was keen to work with us. So therefore, we were able to engage with them at what we categorise as a medium level of engagement.
You see, you say, and you said in the press that you acted decisively, and you've said that, you know, like you've resolved the issue. Could we really say that you'd acted decisively when it's taken 4 years and £400,000 to sort out what you perceive to be the problem?
Well, what we have done is engaged with the organisation, and I'll flag firstly that the association itself approached us in terms of the difficult governance issues that it was experiencing. We engaged with them in a way that meant we were working with the management committee to enable it to resolve the issues that it was experiencing, and that's an approach we will always take where we're able to. As a proportionate regulator, we will look to the organisation first to resolve the situation, rather than use our statutory intervention powers at a very early stage, unless we thought the situation was so serious and the risks to the interests of tenants so significant that it merited us using our statutory powers quickly in that way. But I think in these situations, I would say look at the result, look at the outcome. The organisation as a result. Well, the outcome for tenants, I think, is it now has an organisation that's considerably more better governed. It has a level of stability, and it's an organisation that should be in a position to continue to deliver for its tenants.
Colleagues mentioned the issue of consistency earlier. You'll also be aware of the Sunday Herald's article on your lack of intervention, I can only put it, with Dumfries and Galloway Housing Partnership in the same area, which is a much larger organisation. Now, Dumfries and Galloway Housing Partnership, as has been outlined in the Sunday Herald, entered into a contract with a failing company and awarded it £38 million to build houses. It subsequently collapsed. Many houses were left incomplete. Many tenants were extremely unsatisfied with the quality of work, and a huge amount of public money was wasted. Despite getting complaints from tenants, which you didn't get in the case of Loreburn, it took you 2 years to start an investigation into Dumfries and Galloway Housing Partnership. You didn't engage with tenants, and you actually allowed Dumfries and Galloway Housing Partnership to conduct its own self-examination. There seems to be an inconsistency the way you've dealt with a smaller housing association having unspecified governance issues which don't actually affect the way tenants live, to this huge waste of public money where tenants have complained and they're not getting a good service. You seem to have had a very hands-off approach, and it's been suggested in other witnesses the committee's taken that some housing associations are so big that perhaps that they're protected from your levels of intervention that have been experienced by, say, for example, Loreburn. Why has Loreburn had to pay £400,000 for consultants when this big housing association that wasted huge amounts of public money has had a hands-off approach?
Can I say first and foremost that we have received no complaints from tenants of the houses involved in the situation with DGHP. That's first and foremost to say. We have engaged with the association in response to the media coverage that ensued, and we've received appropriate assurances around the situation and handling. There is not a regulatory issue here for us to become involved in. Can I also say in relation to the sense that there's some distinction drawn by us around organisations and their size. That's not the case. We're entirely neutral on organisational size, form, nature. Our sole objective in terms of the work that we undertake and any interventions we have is to protect the interests of tenants and other service users.
Why did you allow DGHP to investigate itself?
That's a common practice in many regulated sectors where you look for an internal investigation to be undertaken, and if that provides you with appropriate levels of assurance, then that's a proportionate response to any issues that come out. And they were undertaken by their internal auditors, an independent firm that's governed by a range of professional standards and requirements placed upon them, and we take assurance from that.
This is a landlord who hired a builder which had a poor credit rating, which anybody who had checked and got into any level of scrutiny would have seen had serious financial problems. They made a major mistake which resulted in huge amounts of public money being wasted, and you don't think that they merit the level of scrutiny that smaller societies do?
Well, again, all I can restate is that we don't make a distinction in terms of the approach we take on the basis of size.
But what about the waste of public money and a serious failing? I would have said that's a very serious failing.
Can I say that Scottish Government, who were one of the significant investment partners in the particular project, have advised us that there's been no waste of public money in this regard. The houses have been delivered. We've got assurance that the level of tenant satisfaction with those new properties is very much at the level of the normal industry standards in this regard. Again, I have to stress that there has been no basis for us to undertake a regulatory intervention in this situation. And indeed, I think had we done so in response to media noise, then we would quite legitimately have been open to criticism of being reactionary and being heavy-handed and being disproportionate in the approach we took.
Well, I can assure you that there's a great deal of tenant dissatisfaction with their houses, and they've been going to their elected representatives of all parties to complain about that. And I think it's, I would be very surprised if that dissatisfaction from tenants hadn't reached you. Just finally, in the course of these interventions in Lower Burn, a number of people came forward to offer support. One of them was a former board member of your organisation, Alex Condy. Mr Condy resigned from your board in 2012 because of this issue of proportionality. He felt that you had damaged Fife Housing Association with your interventions there, and you could have caused serious problems to a well-functioning organisation. The committee is obviously hearing from people who share Mr Condy's concerns, and it's become a big issue. Surely Mr Condy's resignation, which was outlined in considerable detail to you at the time, surely that should have rung alarm bells with you that your interventions were actually harming many well-performing social landlords?
Again, in that regard, I would perhaps direct the committee to discuss that reality of the situation with Fife Housing Association. Take it from the horse's mouth rather than from ourselves. You know, I would be very careful in the comment I would make around the resignation of a former board member, but the basis of that resignation, my understanding of it is not what you've set out.
Yeah, well, Mr Condy wrote to the
John,
House.
do you have a final question?
Yeah, my final question would be, you've referred us back to the housing associations who you believe will kind of validate what you've said here today. But this committee has taken quite a lot of evidence that suggests that there's a climate of fear amongst housing associations, so that there are very few housing associations who would actually speak out against the regulator. Doesn't that concern you, that you're presiding over that climate of fear? When the Federation conducted a survey of their members, many asked to remain anonymous. Doesn't that concern you?
Well, I'm not aware that there's a climate of fear. My direct engagements with social landlords, of which I have many, doesn't demonstrate to me that there's a climate of fear. I have very open and frank discussions with a large number of associations, both at officer and board level. The engagements we've had with board members and committee members of housing associations directly through things like the Governance Matters events, at which 70–80% of associations attended, didn't give us any indication that there was this climate of fear. Clearly, it is a concern if there are perceptions out there, and we would want to work with the relevant stakeholder organisations, the relevant representative bodies to address those kind of concerns and issues. First and foremost, though, we will look to our statutory objective that's been given to us by this Parliament to ensure that everything that we do is about protecting the interests of tenants and other service users.
Okay, thank you very much. We've had a very full session this morning. I'm very grateful to you for coming before the committee and for the constructive and transparent way in which you've engaged with all members of the committee and with other members present this morning. We may have some issues that we wish to follow up on with the chair of the Scottish Housing Regulator, and indeed, as you've suggested, with individual housing associations, so we will reflect on that as a committee. And I think you've been very helpful in informing our understanding of the issues, and we have an opportunity next week to raise some of those with the Minister for Housing and Welfare, who will appear before the committee as part of a general housing update. So once again, thank you very much, and we now move into private session.
Thank you.